This course's section on media is designed as an extension of our earlier discussion of culture. We'll use this time to outline some media history, mainly in the US and in the Commonwealth countries like India and Canada, which used to be part of the British Empire. We'll then examine three main media theories: pluralism, cultural imperialism, and postmodernism, along with recent efforts at culture jamming, designed to help us answer questions about what the mass media really are, whose interests they serve, and what technological change can really accomplish as we move away from a broadcast model of media and towards increasingly social media and narrowcasting. To outline this a bit further, we can break down the story of mass media into three separate parts. The first of these is the rise of broadcasting, including airwave allocation. In other words, the process of giving different broadcasters space on the airwaves so that the signals wouldn't literally collide and make the whole mess impossible to understand. With the rise of film and then TV, though, we see a new set of concerns emerge over so-called content providers, the companies that produce media content, like film studios, TV production units, and so on. Classically, 1 and 2 were separated from each other by law. Broadcasters could bid on media content, they could bid on shows, but they couldn't control media production from the top down. In recent years, though, this has all changed. And what we've seen is the rise of huge media conglomerates, which control content production, broadcasting, and infrastructure, and which have raised all kinds of concerns over really who owns and controls the media, and what the consequences are for a democratic society. Well, traditionally, mass media is a state-building enterprise. In the UK, Australia, and Canada, to pick a few examples, media were not controlled by government. You want to make a note of this one because this is important, but by what was called a crown corporation, a corporate body created by government to run a broadcaster. The broadcaster would then operate as a public utility, something like the water supply or the electric company, which everyone was supposed to have access to. The system was paid for by a mix of general public revenues and special audio-visual taxes on TVs, which still exist today in the UK and elsewhere. If you ever lived in Europe for any meaningful stretch of time, you'll know most European countries still have audio-visual taxes whenever you buy a TV set. The effect was to create a robust public broadcasting network. The content on public broadcasting networks wasn't always really exciting. I grew up in Canada watching the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or the CBC, the logo for which you see over there in blue in the middle of the slide. So you can trust me on that one. It wasn't always the most riveting stuff. But the underlying idea was to make media a public utility that had high-quality news, access to a lot of information on what was going on, and was accessible to everyone. In the US, of course, we've classically organized media very differently. Here, media has been controlled on a commercial model, with networks able to license content to syndicates that then broadcast it and raise revenue through local advertising. Well, this big difference between the public model of media in the UK, Canada, in the European Union, and privatized media in the US used to be the big story and used to explain a big part of how media worked in different parts of, let's say, the developed world. This distinction, though, has progressively broken down. In the last couple of decades, the regulations that used to limit media ownership and concentration have largely vanished. Today, cable companies, content providers, and broadcasters can all be owned under one roof, with corporations such as Time Warner Cable and News Corp having vast media properties around the world. The graphic on the slide gives you some ideas of some of these developments and the way they've changed basically in the last 30 years or so. Well, you might think that we have more choice today than we did back then. After all, many of your parents or your grandparents might have only had access to the big three networks in the US, CBS, ABC, and NBC. While today there are literally hundreds of cable channels to choose from. Same thing for Brits, who went from having 4 channels, none of them very exciting, to having a great many choices. But at the same time that we have more choice, ownership of media is in fewer and fewer hands. And the consequences of it are, depending on your point of view, potentially very troubling. Let's look at the issue a little bit further. The 3 big theoretical approaches are, respectively, pluralism, Marxism, and postmodernism. Pluralism, as the slide suggests, is the market-friendly view. On this account, the world is out there, and the media are neutral instruments for reporting on it and reflecting on it. At the same time, media institutions respond to consumer demand. We have the media that we do today, say pluralists, because that's what people want. Sure, there is bias. People are never perfectly objective. But the marketplace solves the problem in the pluralist view. You don't like watching Fox? You watch MSNBC. If enough people want the BBC to be available to them, they will demand it. The market will provide it. Long story short, the idea goes that the market will provide a wide variety of goods to meet consumer demand. If there is demand for new, different kinds of media products, the market will step in and take care of that too. Well, this point of view, of course, has a lot of adherents. Many people look at media products pretty much the same way they look at choice in the area of beer sales or wine sales. On the other hand, from a more critical point of view, you can see some of the ways in which the pluralist approach maybe leaves some issues out, leaves some problems out. Marxists argue that ownership affects content quite profoundly. This works both explicitly and implicitly. Explicitly, media owners might have political preferences that will come out in, say, who gets invited to talk shows, in what kinds of documentaries are and are not aired, and so on. Implicitly, it means that media industries are very close to people in power, political elites, business leaders, and so on. And so they aren't really capable of criticizing those people because they are owned by those people and operated for those people. Yes, there are differences between media networks, but from a Marxian approach, these are pretty small and trivial. In reality, the media serve the interests of the power elites. The more they are owned by those same power elites, the more tightly and the more seamlessly they serve those same interests. Well, this argument is discussed extensively in your text. It's also very nicely illustrated in Micah Wright's Propaganda Remix project, where he created a series of World War II-style images designed to suggest that the media are basically selling propaganda, and that they do so not literally by beating people over the head with a single message, but by asking some questions, by raising some issues, while steadfastly refusing to raise others. So, for example, we get news stories criticizing the wisdom of providing people food stamps. Stories that question agricultural subsidies are far more rare. Likewise, military spending is often covered far more carefully and respectively than, say, spending on education or hospitals, which is often given a much more critical airing. This is a nice illustration of the Marxist argument. People are more or less manipulated into seeing the world a certain way. After a while, they can no longer see it any other way. The ownership of media industries feeds the kinds of questions, the kinds of issues that people naturally wind up asking. The third perspective, postmodernism, basically contests the Marxian approach. The argument here is that the media content does not manipulate people. Rather, we actively produce and interpret what we see and hear for ourselves, and often come to different conclusions about what it means. You might equally see a Chevron ad touting the virtues of the oil company's renewable energy efforts. And instead of just believing it at face value, what the postmodernists would say, start to think of other things you could do with this message. Like, for example, this, which is what the Yes Men did, parodying the Chevron campaign to highlight the problems of oil companies exercising too much power over democratic institutions. Or over the ecological problems that are generated by oil production and, of course, by oil spills. And, of course, I think this one speaks for itself. Well, there are lots of examples of this, of different kinds of activist groups basically taking media messages and flipping them around. Adbusters, based in Vancouver, Canada, is probably one of the most famous examples of these sorts of activities, where they took a whole series of Absolute vodka ads to, let's say, highlight the problems of excess alcohol consumption, and of course the problem of drinking and driving, using the very iconography of the Absolute vodka image against itself. I'm obviously not going to sort of say one theory is intrinsically superior to the other, but at the same time, I'm hoping this overview gives you a little bit of a background into the issues that your text is discussing with regards to the media, and hopefully also a desire to dig into the issue further and learn a little bit more.